So good evening, and thank you all for being here. And most importantly, I want to thank Buffalo State University for hosting us. I want to thank Professor Bonanno on many levels for all that she's done to bring all of you here and to organize all of this and to get the money to be here. And I have to say, on a personal note, none of this presentation would have been possible without Professor Bonanno, because she has been a mentor and a friend and said, Carolyn, you need to study this, keep going, do this. And so I thank you, Professor Bonanno, for that, because this would not have happened. You can give her a round of applause. She's worked really hard. So my students know I'm originally from Buffalo, so I am thrilled to be here. My mother graduated from Buffalo State College. At the time, it was called Teachers College, so it's really a pleasure to be here back in Buffalo. So the title of my talk is Defending Democracy, the European Union's Combating Antisemitism Policy. And this talk comes out of a book that I have just completed and sent out for review. And it took significant field research in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, speaking to non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, and really understanding what is happening in Europe. And I started this project actually in 2020 during COVID. That's when it began, when I hopped on an event for the envoy for combating anti-Semitism of the European Union. And I had no idea what that position was, that it had existed, and what was going on in Europe. And so that kind of got me started to studying this question and looking at the European Union's anti-Semitism policy. And you may not think about anti-Semitism as a policy area. And what I'm going to kind of talk about today is that as scholars, we don't think about it in that way. And I think we need to think about it in that way. I'm going to kind of lay that out for you. And again, this research is also funded, and I have to say this, by the European Union. So I thank the European Union for their funding for this research. So these are some of the questions that I hope to answer. I know it's a lot in 45 minutes or so I'm going to do the best that I can. But I'm going to start out with the question of what is anti-Semitism? You hear that terminology quite frequently. And the question, well, what is it? What does that mean? So some of you may think, well, it's Jew hate. It's a hatred of Jews. And I usually tell my students, well, it is and it isn't. There's a lot more to it when you think about what is anti-Semitism. Robert Wistrup, who is a scholar of anti-Semitism, has coined it as the longest hate. And I think that is a good way to start. The longest hate. If you think about anti-Semitism, another way to think about it is that it is the canary in the coal mine. Because once you see anti-Semitism emerging, it always leads to the hatred of other groups that are disenfranchised or marginalized in society. So when we see the rise of anti-Semitism, it tells us we have a problem, and that'll get us to the next question that I'd like to talk about. But before I get there, anti-Semitism, it's a shapeshifter. It changes all the time, the way that it manifests, the way it expresses itself, and it will shift even during the same time period. It shows itself oftentimes in ways that racism can express itself, but it also expresses itself differently than other forms of racism. And the best way that I can explain this is the way that Deborah Lipstadt, who was the former U.S. envoy dealing with anti-Semitism, and she's a scholar in her own right, talks about anti-Semitism as both a punching up and a punching down. So the punching down is what we usually think of racism. That the punching down is that the Jew, the dirty Jew, Jew is vermin, Jew is bacteria. Those kinds of ideas. But the punching up is different. The punching up you don't usually see with other forms of racism. And the punching up is the Jew that controls the banks, the Jew that controls government, the Jew that somehow controls the world. And what that leads us into are a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of conspiracy fantasies about Jews controlling the world. If we believe that, if we believe that a small group of people controls the world, or controls government, or controls the banks, controls the economy, what does that tell us about democracy? It makes us question the very institutions of governance. It makes us question the legitimacy of the state. It undermines government. And that's really dangerous. And those kinds of conspiracy fantasies that come out of anti-Semitism erode democracies. And it makes us question, well, should we even have democracy? Because democracy, well, the Jews are telling us democracy is good and they're controlling everything, so therefore democracy must not be good. It's all a ruse. And that's the danger of anti-Semitism. It erodes our democratic institutions and our understanding of government in a democratic regime. So where does the EU come into all of this? Why is it that the European Union has designed a policy to address anti-Semitism? What does that mean, a policy about anti-Semitism? And then what is the EU doing? You're all here to talk about the European Union. What are the policies? What are they doing? So I'm going to try to get to some of that. I'll do my best. There's a lot. But let me first take the question of, why is combating anti-Semitism important to the European Union? So this is a photo of Katharina von Schnorrbein, who is, her formal title is EU Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life. That office, the coordinator's office, was appointed within the Commission. The Commission is the executive body of the European Union. She was appointed in this position in 2015, and she's held that position since. And I think this quote is quite telling. And she states, if we do not manage to make sure that Jews in Europe are safe, and given that we always say this European project was built on the ashes of the Second World War, this includes the ashes of 6 million Jews, then this European project will have failed. This policy, combating anti-Semitism, is at the essence of what the European project is about. And she is not the only person to have made this profound statement. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, again, the head executive, has said this many times. And her predecessor, Juncker, also has made this statement. So this is not something that is recent. It has been mentioned amongst the Commission presidents over time, and a realization of that link between anti-Semitism and the threat to democracy. And if you think about the European Union itself, one of the threats to the European Union right now is democratic backsliding. Where's Hungary? Where's Hungary? Where's Orban? Right, is Orban here? All right. All right, so Victor over here, Mr. Orban. There you go, right? And so what's your take on, to put you all on the spot, right? All come from the far right. And the far right, there you go, threatens democracy. And Viktor Orban has made opportunities to talk about, beware of what the European Union is doing, because they're in cahoots with George Soros and Alex Soros. That's what you hear from Orban. So George Soros and his son Alex Soros, George, Holocaust survivor, and has become the stand-in for the Jew. Someone who supported liberal democracy and funded a lot of programs. And by the way, funded Viktor Orban to go to the UK to study. So that's why the European Union is concerned about anti-Semitism. They realize, at least in the leadership, realizing what a threat that is to the democratic order of Europe. I want to show you. So I said anti-Semitism is a problem. But I have to show you. You're like, is it really? Because unfortunately, if I had speakers come to my campus and say, anti-Semitism, it's not a problem. So this data, and I can't cite it all because it would be a whole other slide and a half, and you're probably wondering, why don't you have 27 countries up there? Because 27 countries don't record anti-Semitic acts. So these are the countries that have done an okay job, mixed, of actually recording anti-Semitic acts within their country. So if you just take a look at these numbers, and you're probably wondering, why does she only have from 2022 to 2024? Because I want to highlight something here. October 7, 2023. Hamas's violent attack on Israel. Those numbers for 2023, most of those, and look at the jump from 2022 to 2023. What explains that increase is after October 7th. It's the last 2 months of the year. Explain that rise. And then look at 2024, still increasing in these countries. If you look at Austria, 111% increase. Czechia, 106% increase. France, 260% increase. France has the largest Jewish population in Europe. Germany has the second, in the European Union, I should say. And Germany has the second largest Jewish population in the EU. 248% increase in Germany. These are not good numbers. This is a real concern for Europe and for the safety, not just of Jews in Europe, but for all of society in Europe. Because much of the things that are pushing anti-Semitism forward are forms of extremism. And by the way, the Russians have gotten in on this. So after October 7th, there were several houses in Paris and in Berlin that were daubed with Jewish stars, reminiscent of the Holocaust. They figured out that they were Moldovan operatives that the Russians, the doppelganger, had sent to do that. There were also the vandalism of the Shoah Museum in Paris. There's also links to Russia with that. Why is Russia getting in on the game? Because Russia also knows that anti-Semitism is a threat to democracy. And the European leadership understands that. Because if government can't protect you and these horrible things happen, then what's government for, right? They're not doing their job. So again, it undermines government and governance. Okay, so let's talk about an EU policy to actually address anti-Semitism. And I know we usually don't think about anti-Semitism policy as a policy area. And so what I try to do in my book is say, look, there's a way we can think about this as a unique policy area and as a standalone policy area. And I think that's something very unique about the European Union. When we think about anti-Semitism, it's usually lumped into other forms of discrimination. Racism, xenophobia, LGBTQI. These are all groups that are marginalized, and they are all equally important. So I'm not saying one's more important than the other. This is not the Olympics of the repressed. But what is problematic is that anti-Semitism is unique. And so you need to create a policy that addresses its uniqueness. And that's what the European Union has started to do and trying to promote the member states to do the same. And then we'll talk about some of the tools. So very quickly, I'm not going to go into this too much. I pulled this right from the book. So thinking about, what are the goals of a policy to address anti-Semitism and then what are the policy tools that can be done? And then I'll talk about, well, what has the EU actually done in these areas? So you have to identify what is anti-Semitism. You've got to define it. If you don't know what it is, how do you shape a policy around it? You need data to know what's going on. Is there a rise in anti-Semitism? The data I showed you demonstrates that in some member states, but of course we don't have data in other member states. Another piece, an important goal, is creating and implementing a legal framework to address anti-Semitism. You need to have legislation. You need to have prosecutors and judges and police that are trained in identifying and understanding what is anti-Semitism. And how do we prosecute it differently? It's a hate crime and receive a higher punishment. So these are some of the areas where we think about it as a policy. We need to prevent the spread of it. So we need research to understand where does it come from, how is it promoted, and of course, as an educator, education. Education is probably one of the strongest tools that we have to stop the spread of hatred of any kind, but also of anti-Semitism. Security. Security of Jewish sites, Jewish institutions. Unfortunately, that is a part of a policy when you talk about anti-Semitism and countering terrorism and extremism, which is, by the way, the EU has a whole policy separate about dealing with extremism in Europe because they have certainly significant problems, terrorist attacks as well. They are deeply concerned about extremism in Europe. And this last one, a little bit less that the EU deals with, but care for victims. If you're a victim of anti-Semitism, we need to have those victims able to report those crimes and to be cared for and to help them through the process of prosecution. So that's sort of a way to think about anti-Semitism as a policy, the goals, and what might be some tools that might be utilized. So in 2021, the European Union created, and this is through the Commission, I think what's really interesting here, and for all of you, my EU people that study the EU, what I find so fascinating about this policy is that it did not come from member states. Member states wrote agendas for our program for the rest of the weekend. Member states weren't clamoring for this. The Commission pushed this forward. This really shows the European Union as an entity that promotes an agenda. The power of the Commission. And the Commission, began with this discussion about we need to deal with anti-Semitism, and they got the Council on board, the heads of government on board. The European Parliament has passed resolutions as well to address anti-Semitism. But it came from the Commission, an EU institution. So in 2021, the Commission itself creates a strategy to combat anti-Semitism, and very interestingly, and foster Jewish life. The title of that policy to me is fascinating because I don't know of any other policy that talks about fostering a community. And for the Jewish community in Europe, and I would get this all the time with interviews, is that this policy isn't just about the Holocaust. It's about living Jews. It's about the living, breathing community, and can Jews continue to live in Europe because they have lived in Europe for centuries. So it's a very interesting title to the policy. And by the way, it was Ursula von der Leyen who added that into the title. She insisted that that would be in the title of the policy. So in the strategy, there are 3 pillars, and just very quickly, preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, protecting and fostering Jewish life in the European Union, and then the 3rd pillar is education, research, Holocaust remembrance. So out of that strategy, the European Union told member states, y'all need to create one. Either you create a standalone policy or you put it within a larger racism, xenophobia, discrimination, whatever it is within your country policy. So currently, 23 member states have fulfilled that obligation. 4 have not. And this is the uniqueness of the European Union. Member states have sovereignty. But 23 members have instituted something. And I think the more interesting piece of this is that 14 member states have actually created a standalone policy to combat anti-Semitism. Now, we could say, have they implemented well? Are they doing things? What's happening? It's a mixed bag. And again, that goes back to the sovereignty of member states. During my research, I focused mostly on France, which does not have a standalone policy because they have the idea of universalism, which is very ingrained in the idea of the French Republic. But they have a policy that is with the other, both with LGBTQ and racism policy. Germany has probably one of the most institutionalized policies, and they have a standalone policy and probably one of the most advanced and again, sort of institutionalized policy. 20 member states now have anti-Semitism special envoys. So they work both internally and externally in the international realm to address anti-Semitism. 26 member states have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. IRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. That's really important because, like I started with, if you don't have a definition, if you don't know what it is, you can't create a policy around it. So if we look at EU initiatives and putting it into the framework that I started with about, well, what does anti-Semitism policy look like? Well, as I've already mentioned, the EU, all the EU institutions adopted the IRA definition in 2017. The IRA definition officially, and it's a longer story and I'm happy to tell you at another point, was officially registered, if you will, in 2016. So the European Union was one of the early adopters of that definition. There are approximately 43 countries that also use that definition. San Diego just adopted that definition a few weeks ago. So many states in the United States are adopting that definition. The United States is using that definition. So it's become, in policy fields, a working definition to address anti-Semitism. The EU has also been providing funding to collect data on anti-Semitism. So when I showed you the data earlier and I said, well, I don't have data for all the countries, the EU is trying to address that, to get member states to work together and to create data that is actually comparable. Because right now each member state does it differently, and so we can't compare that chart that I showed you. You can't compare different countries because they're using different measurements. So the EU has worked with, through their sort of institutional network, but also creating ENMA, which is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization to gather that kind of data. Through the Commission, they've established a working group that is an official working group. They meet twice a year. It brings together all member states and one representative from that country. It's usually the umbrella Jewish organizations and specialists in whatever the issue area that they're talking about. So for example, right after October 7th, the working group met and trying to figure out what do we do with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. What are some of the best practices in other member states? What can we learn from each other? Creating what we call an epistemic community, a community of experts that communicate with one another. So this piece that I want to mention is a legal piece. And it's really interesting because it dates back to 2008. It wasn't meant necessarily for anti-Semitism, but it addresses anti-Semitism. So it's called the Council Framework Decision of 2008. So the way that a Council Framework Decision works, the European Union passes this, member states have to meet the requirements, at least in it's the spirit of the requirement. The EU doesn't tell member states you must do exactly this to achieve it, but you have to achieve the goal of the law. And EU law is supreme to national law. So the 2008 decision framework, and note that date, Orban was not elected yet in 2008, and we didn't have all these far-right governments in 2008. So I can pick on Italy because they're also from Hofstra. So, from 2008, we didn't have the far-right parties controlling many of the member states. It took 7 years, by the way, for this legislation to be passed. It was not easy. But two pieces I want to pull up, and I put the text on the slide, that member states were to make punishable criminal acts, the incitement of violence or hate, directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin, including by public dissemination or distribution of tracts, pictures, or other material. Could apply to the internet, right? So think about it. In an American context, it's hate speech. That's what it's referencing. It's saying you have to make hate speech criminal in your countries. And the second piece relates directly to anti-Semitism, that publicly condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes when the conduct is carried out in a manner likely to incite to violence or hatred against such a group or member of such a group. What are we talking about? The Holocaust. Holocaust denial, if it incites hate, is against the law, and it should be against the law in your member state. That's what the EU put forth. Except that member states didn't follow it. So in 2014, the Commission writes a report and says, these countries are all bad actors, and nothing happened. But in 2020, Europe had a reckoning, just like we had a reckoning here in the United States. After the murder of George Floyd, Ursula von der Leyen makes this speech, very famous speech in front of the European Parliament, basically saying, look at all of us. We're all white. We need to pay attention and be more inclusive and to have a racial reckoning in Europe. And so out of that, the EU created a strategy to address racism. And in that strategy, it says if member states have not complied, we will start infringement proceedings. That comes out of the Commission. So the Commission in 2020, 2021 begins infringement proceeding against 13 member states that were in violation of that 2008 framework. 6 countries are now in full compliance, and the Commission is still working with the other countries. So what that means when you have infringement, you go before the European Court of Justice, there can be fines imposed, so there's a little teeth to that. And that brings me to the Digital Services Act, which I'm going to move through really quickly, because I know there's a lot I can cover, but I'm not going to do that. But for all of you in the room, you guys are in social media probably way more than I am. How many of you have seen something anti-Semitic online? And probably every single one of you should have your hand up because you've all seen it. And if you think you haven't seen it, you probably have. So what the EU has created in the Digital Services Act, part of the General Data Privacy, which was already spoken about, the Council Decision Framework of 2008 is part of that. So what the EU has set up, in 2016, they created something called the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct was a voluntary system where platforms would voluntarily have connections to flaggers, and the flaggers could flag content that was considered illegal content, hate speech content. And so out of that, it's now become more legally embedded in the Digital Services Act. It's not simply voluntary. The various platforms now have to share their algorithms because those algorithms certainly play a role in the spread of different forms of anti-Semitism. There is a significant fine now for noncompliance. It's 6% of global turnover. It's pretty significant. And the one thing I'll mention is that right now there are formal proceedings against Elon Musk and X related to right after October 7th and the kinds of the terrorism, the anti-Semitic material that was allowed to remain online. And so that's still going through the court. So it's an interesting test case to see what teeth the Digital Services Act will have. So in the realm of education, just very quickly, even my grant has to do with education. The European Union is giving money for all kinds of educational programs. There's a big program they're working with UNESCO as part of this to provide education in K through 12. There is an enormous European Holocaust research infrastructure that has been created. It's all in digital spaces, but the EU has contributed a significant amount of money to that. There's a lot of work on connecting Holocaust memorial sites together and making that much more visible across Europe. And so I want to leave time for questions and I want to conclude, but I think that, the take home is that the EU has really become a leader in the formulation of a policy and a standalone policy to address anti-Semitism. And as I've already kind of mentioned, the sovereignty of member states certainly shapes the extent to which that policy is achieved, the extent to which that policy can be implemented. And so as much as we have these implementation challenges, I think that it is incredibly important for this policy to exist. It's important to the European Union. It's important for democracy. And I want to just end on, I love this quote. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he spoke before the European Parliament, and he said, "The hate that begins with the Jew never ends with Jews. We make a great mistake if we think anti-Semitism is a threat only to Jews. It is a threat first and foremost to Europe and to the freedoms it took centuries to achieve." So I will end with that. Thank you.